Good evening from New York. Any hope of plugging the underwater gusher at BP's oil well in the Gulf of Mexico remaining months away. But tonight in our fifth story, a cap that would at least contain the spill appears to be being moved closer to the damaged pipe. If it works, that cap, attached to a mile-long hose, would begin siphoning off much of the crude oil into a ship on the water's surface. What would be, on day 45, the first true good news of the crisis. Robots today using a giant pair of shears to cut that damaged riser pipe deep in the Gulf of Mexico. Coast Guard Admiral Allen briefing this morning that the shears making a more jagged cut than the saw would have, so placing a cap over it will now be more challenging, and the top hat cap will not fit as snugly as officials would like. Of course, that did not stop the CEO, Mr. Hayward, from calling just the cut a milestone.
Over the last 36 hours, we have cleared the riser from the top of the wellhead, and the team is currently working to complete the clean-up operation before we put the cap onto the top of the well. And it's an important milestone, and in some senses, of course, it's just the beginning.
Yet, in an interview with the Financial Times, Mr. I would like my life back, admitting that BP was not totally prepared for and lacked some of the essential equipment to deal with the massive oil disaster it created in the Gulf. Quoting, "What is undoubtedly true is that we did not have the tools you would want in your toolkit." He then patted his own company on the back for its containment measures on the surface, adding, "Considering how big this has been, very little has got away from us." Here is something that has gotten away from BP, its cover-up effort on the shores of the Gulf. Journalists from multiple news organizations reporting that they have been blocked from taking photographs of dead animals on the beaches of the Gulf. These devastating pictures taken by Charlie Rydell of the Associated Press. In some cases, cops and local contractors who are blocking access and leading them away, telling them that they are acting on the orders of BP. In fact, the contract local boat operators signed before being hired by BP expressly forbids them from talking to the media. One contractor telling the New York Daily News, "They specifically informed us that they did not want these pictures of the dead animals. They know the ocean will wipe away most of the evidence." If only the ocean really could do that. Louisiana Governor Jindal seemingly less concerned with how his state has been despoiled and brought to economic ruin than with returning immediately to drill, baby, drill. In a letter to the president, the Louisiana Republican arguing that his state has already suffered crippling economic consequences, asking the White House to rethink its decision to issue a ban on deepwater drilling in the Gulf, including at 22 platforms currently in operation off the Louisiana coast. Quoting again, "The last thing we need is to enact public policies that will certainly destroy thousands of existing jobs while preventing the creation of thousands more." The White House replying in part that a repeat of the BP Deepwater Horizon spill would have grave economic consequences for regional commerce and do further damage to the environment. Apparently, Governor Jindal has to have that explained to him, which brings us to the president's attempt to address directly for the first time criticism that he has not responded to this crisis with perhaps enough emotion or anger. In an interview, the president saying that he is, in fact, quote, "furious at this entire situation because somebody didn't think through the consequences of their actions." The president adding, however, that being angry still does not mean he's going to yell. "I would love to just spend a lot of my time venting and yelling at people, but that's not the job I was hired to do," Mr. Obama said. "My job is to solve this problem, and ultimately this isn't about how me and how angry I am. My job is to make sure they, BP, are being held accountable." In a moment, the latest on the containment effort with conservation consultant Rick Steiner. First, let's turn to our own political analyst, Richard Wolff, the author of Renegade, The Making of a President. Richard, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
Governor Jindal arguing that his state has suffered crippling economic consequences. So President Obama thus must resume, the governor is implying here, is he not, that the very thing that led to those crippling economic consequences.
Yep, that would be about right. You know, there are a couple of ways to look at this. You can obviously look at the lack of logic that Bobby Jindal is expressing here, but there are two sort of political strands that are playing out here. One, on the national level, you have the perpetual Republican war on anything to do with the Obama administration. The underlying argument in his letter was that somehow this oil spill was the result of the failure of government. So really, all that you need to do here is let business do its job, which it's done so spectacularly well in BP's case. There is a local strand of this as well, and this is something that I think folks on the left have to come come to terms with. The local politics in many of these states is still supportive of offshore drilling because of the economic situation, because of the jobs. So what ought to be a teaching, learning experience about the true cost of this business is wrapped up in the local needs of these economies, which clearly Jindal is sort of pandering to here rather than taking a leadership position.
And the governor has been very vocal about how BP has been less than capable in managing the fallout of this disaster, something that the company's CEO also admitted to today. So the idea is give them more chances to do this as soon as possible. Isn't the governor sort of working at cross purposes with himself? I mean, even in that local context of what this means just for the economy of Louisiana?
Well, yeah, to a degree he is, and actually I think he's working at cross purposes to the real political advances he has made in his own right. You know, here was a guy who needed salvation from his disastrous performance in the response to the State of the Union, and here he has actually just recently, in the last few hours, made significant advance in getting the administration's approval for these barrier islands. So he's staked out a very effective position. He has delivered for his state. It is illogical, again, that Republicans who have prided themselves on the economic rigors of their arguments can see a case for starting up drilling when the drilling clearly isn't safe. I mean, what kind of trust are they putting in the same companies that they're railing against? It really doesn't make much sense.
Does this make much sense that part of the White House response to Jindal was to say, look, we're currently offering the economic injury loans to the impacted businesses on the Gulf Coast, presumably because this is the expenditure of money to individuals rather than to large corporations. Isn't the governor going to denounce this and then pose next to the checks like this was the Publishers Clearinghouse giveaway?
Well, we saw some of that dynamic with the stimulus money, but I think he's got to support the fishermen. You know, they are the truest voices in all of this, the most immediate humanized impact of this whole thing, and those are the small businesses who would benefit from this kind of thing. As for the tourism, which spreads throughout his state, you know, it's going to be harder to sort of pose with that for the cameras, but on an economic basis, he's got to take the aid, and to argue that the oil companies themselves need to be in the job creation phase is so premature. Jindal's a clever guy. I mean, why does he think that this is good policy? He may think it's good short-term politics, but in terms of the policy, it's just not ready.
Lastly, the president and anger. Some of us who've been critical of his approach haven't been asking him to yell and shout or anything. They just, I believe, we just have been asking for him to express the consequences that he has in mind for these people. He can be as calm about it as he wants to. Is that message not getting across, that it's what he's talking about that should contain or express our anger? He doesn't have to have his own anger involved?
Well, the White House talked about putting a $69 million bill to BP today, so I guess that's one way of expressing some anger.
Exactly.
You know, they are moving on a number of different fronts, but I think the bigger thing for someone who likes to sort of be a professor-in-chief here is to start talking about the other hidden costs, which are now all too obviously washing up on our shores, of cheap oil, of oil exploration that isn't ready, that in a desperate rush for cheaper fuel and energy, we're incurring costs to other businesses that we have to factor into future discussions. That's the kind of discussion he can lead. Whether or not it's angry is up to him, but it's certainly a debate that needs to happen.
Our own Richard Wolff, as always. Great thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Keith.